Today's daf is daf Yud Beis, and we're going to begin with the Nechush. Just finishing up on the sugya that we covered yesterday, and this is 4 lines down from the top. The Gemara is now asking on the Brisa. It says in the Brisa that if she was married once and then married a second time, then the second person, the second Mekadesh, does not have the possibility of being Toein Tainus Besulin, because he has to assume that she's Bechezkas Be'ula by virtue of the fact that she was married once before. And the Gemara says the following: okay, we don't have to schlep him into Bezdin with a Tainus Besulin based on Ksuba, because he cannot be Mafsid Hod Ksuba, but V'nechus Shema Zinsa Tachtov Zinsa. What about the other dimension to Tainus Besulin, namely the Isa Beheter? When he comes to Bezdin, if we could only get him into Bezdin to claim that he found it to be a Ba'ula, then we might worry about the possibility that during the Eresin period she had a Be'ila, which would mean Echel Abal, Echel Abal, V'nitma, that she is now Asura Olaf. So why is it that we just tell him, look, you have no claim whatsoever because she was married once before, but the case that we're dealing with is where we have every reason to believe that she in fact is a Basula. And there are Eidim who testify to the effect that immediately after the chuppah, the Baal divorced his wife, the first Baal, or he died, and immediately the second Baal, well, we're not sure of that yet, that's going to be coming down the line, but the second Baal married her, and there's a possibility that she had znus during the Eresin period of the second guy. The second guy is being discouraged, according to the Brisa, from coming into Bezdin because he has no Tainus Psulim. But what about the Iser of Echel Baal? Omar of Sharvia, Kigon Shekidesh Ubal Lialta. This was a case where immediately after the first Baal divorced his wife or died, the second Baal married her, and he married her with both Eresin and Nesuin under the same chuppah immediately. There was no shahus, there was no interval of time during the Eresin when she could have had a znus. Ika demastile amasnisen. There are the others who have the words of Rabbah as an addendum to the Mishnah on Daf Yud Aleph, and all the Shaklavitaria is based on the Mishnah and not on the Bryce. Ika demasnile amasnisen. The Mishnah says, Nesul almana grusha b'chalutza minan nesuit. Ksubasamana. So we're talking about a case of a basula. Now, she's an almana, she was married to someone else, she was a grusha, chalutza. How could she possibly be a basula? And the answer is, this is a case of nichnasa l'chuppah v'lo nivel. Now, the Mishnah doesn't add, and this is crucial, the words that there are Eidim that testify that lo nivel. There's just an assumption on the part of the general public that she's still a basula. And even so, the Mishnah establishes that when the Sheni marries her, he only has to give her a mana, and he has no Tainus Besulin, and the assumption is that she had a Be'ila with her first husband. So we assume that she was married Bechezkas Be'ula. So the Gemara says, Be'sulim and Nesuin Heichi Mishkachasla. There's a contradiction in terms here. You know, she's entered into Nesuin with the first husband, and then you call her Be'sula. How could she be a Be'sula? Kigon Shenichlas Alachup Lo Nivala. Now, her chazaka is that of a Be'sula because the assumption is that she didn't have Be'ila under her first husband. Yet he gives her a Ksuba Mana, and he cannot tie in a Tainus Be'sula. And Omar Rabbitz also meres Kansa becheskas besula v'nimtzeis be'ula ksuba samana. That even though he married her with the assumption that she is a besula, and to his surprise, to his dismay, finds her to be a be'ula, nevertheless, he can only reduce the, well, truth is he's not even going to reduce the ksuba because the ksuba is a ksuba's mana. So basically, even though he was kansa b'cheskas psula, nothing changes over here. There's no tainis psula, and he can't be mapsed on the ksuba, and she'll get the same ksuba as a be'ula, even though she was married b'cheskas psula. But what's important for us to understand here is that he's not going to annul the marriage. He cannot claim mekachtos because the halacha gives this woman a status of a be'ula, and she is a be'ula. Rav Ashi disagrees. Since he married her under the assumption that she's a basula, now he finds her to be a be'ula, then he's out of here. There's no ksuba, there's no marriage, it's a mekatos. The whole deal is off. He was misled. Shiny hacha, why does the Mishnah say that she has a ksuba, albeit of a be'ula mana? In other words, when he married her b'cheskas be'ula, because she already had a chuppah from the previous husband, even though the assumption is she's still a basula, but he has to know and he has to consider the possibility that maybe she's a be'ula. So this is the exception to the rule. But in the normal case, according to Rav Ashi, of kansa b'cheskas psula, the nivtzeis be'ula, mekatos, ein lo klum. She doesn't even get a ksuba of meya. So the Gemara asks again the same shakla v'tarya over and over again. Okay, since he married a becheskas be'ula kaviyachol, therefore there's no tainis pesulin, and he'll pay in the money, and the marriage goes on. Leicha shema zinsa tachta. Amar of Sharvia, the same answer. Now the Gemara is going to compare the two lishonos. The first lishna has a proof to Rabbah from a brisa, and then the Gemara rejects that proof. The second lishna has a proof to Rabbah from the Mishnah, and then rejects that proof. The Gemara explains the following. Man de Masni la brisa, according to the first lishna, that Rabbah had proven his point from the brisa, and Rav Ashi rejected that proof. How much more so in the Mishnah? The Mishnah is a case where there were no Eidim to testify Shalom Nivola. And nevertheless, Rav Ashi says that he married her b'cheskas be'ula because of the fact that she was married and entered into the chuppah with the Rishon. How much more so in our Mishnah, where there are no Eidim. So again, in the Brisa, there were Eidim that testified that Shalom Nivola. In the Mishnah, there were no Eidim. It was just like hearsay. It was like Muchzekes b'einei b'nei Adam, that she's a Basula. And Rav Ashi says that even in the case of the Brisa, which is Eidus Gemura, he's not going to rely on the Eidus Gemura that she's a Basula. He's going to marry a b'cheskas be'ula. So how much more so in the case of the Mishnah where there are no Eidim, certainly he considers the serious possibility that she's a be'ula. So that if the raya of Rabbah was from the Brisa and the Dechia of Rav Ashi was on the Brisa, then how much more so in the case of the Mishnah would Rav Ashi argue that it was he relies on the possibility and the plausibility that she was a be'ul. However, man de masni la masnisim, if Rab and Rav Ashi were having a discussion, a dialogue, a shakla v'taya on the Mishnah, then it's dafka on the Mishnah. The Mishnah has no edim, shelo nivala. Therefore, she's becheskes be'ula. Aval abraisa lo. Rav Ashi never made his comment on the Bryce to say that she's not considered becheskes be'ula, and he's considering the possibility that she was a be'ula. And yet there are two Eidim that testify that she was not a be'ula. Mishum demotzi omar law, the Baal could say to the Isha, no Eidim something. I relied on the Eidim, Shalom Nivalt, and therefore I married you b'cheskes psula. And if I find you to be a be'ula, that is a mekachtos. So according to this Lishna, as it turns out, there's a raya from the Brisa that even in a case of a woman who has a cheskas besula based on the Eidim, and therefore would be konsa becheskas besula, and she turns out to be be'ula, nevertheless she gets a ksuba mana. We're not going to say mekatos. Because if you don't agree with that, then why can't she taina besulin? Why can't he taina besulin and be mafsid the ksuba? She was becheskas besula. So it comes out that the two Lishonos are arguing whether there's a raya from the Brisa for this din. And if Rav Ashi would have heard the Brisa, then he wouldn't have rejected this proof, because the Brisa is a real strong proof of Konta B'cheskas Psula, that he still has to pay the Ksuba, even though she was Nimseis Ba'ula, to support Rabbah. And Rav Ashi might have at that point dropped out and rescinded his position. And it's certainly a case of Konta B'cheskas Besula, because there are two Eidim that testify that she's a Besula. And this leads us to the Mishnah of Yehuda. So they had a minhag that during the period of Erusin, probably right after the Erusin, they would celebrate with a Seuda, and they would invite the Chassan. And not only that, they put the Chassan and the Kala alone in a private room. You know what that means. Shalo be'edim. And there are no Eidim who testify that there was no Yichud. So we have every reason to assume, based on the minhag in Yehuda, that there was Yichud. And he and she, the Chassan and the Kala, were in a private place. As a result, Eino Yachol Liton Tainas Psula. We're going to assume that if he had a private meeting with her, then he was Baal. So if he later on says, well, after the Nesu and after the Chub, I found it to be a Ba'ula, we're going to say, you're the one. He's the guilty one. The Gemara now is medayik from the Lashon of the Mishnah. Midek Tanya Ochel Michal Teika Duchta Yehuda Nami Lo Achil. Amar Abai Shmamino Yehuda Nami Mekomos Yesh. Not everyone in Yehuda had this minhag. It wasn't a uniform and a unanimous minhag that was accepted all over Yehuda. And that's why ha'ochel means that there were those who had that minhag, but there were others who didn't have that minhag. Kedesanya, the Gemara supports this from a Bryce. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Yehuda B'Rishon originally Yomi Achim Sakala Chachas Kodem K'Nisal Chuba K'Dei She'ei Libo Gaspa. In the Yehuda, originally they had a minhag of putting the Chas and Kala together in a closed room privately before the K'Nisa L'Chuppah, so that he would have a certain closeness to her. Probably they didn't subscribe to this because it's not theistic. I mean, it's the Rabbanan said that an arusa is asura law, so we're not going to generate an intimacy and violate the Isur, the Rabbanan of Arutz. The Yehuda B'Rishona Yamamidim Lahem Shnei Shushvinin. Echad lo v'echad lo, k'dei l'mashmei shesachos v'tzakal v'jaskri yisol sulchup. But in order to avoid Ramos, some sort of trickery with regard to Dam Basulim, the Eidim would check out the Chasan, and that's called Shushvinon. They would make sure that he wasn't trying to hide the sheets that had Dam on it. They would check out the Kala to make sure that she didn't bring sheets into the bedroom which had tipos of Dam on it. In other words, in Golil there was no Ramos, Kaviyach. Yehuda Berishona you Osa Hayuhash Osa Vashushvina Yeshenim Bebeis Chasam Kala Yeshenim Bo Begolo Osim. From this brisa, we see that there are makomos in Yehuda that didn't have that minute to be miyachi the chassan kal together before Nisuin, because if we assume that it was unilaterally or universally accepted all over Yehuda, then what's the point of Shushvina? The whole point of Shushvina is to avoid chicanery and trickery and ramos, but he can't be toeing to be mafsid or litzuba because they had the minhag of being miyachid the chasam v'kala. Apparently, there were places in Yehuda that didn't pick up this minhag, and therefore he has a tainis pesulin, and we have to check him out with the Shushvina to guarantee that he's not pulling a fast one. The end of the brisa says the following: the chol shelo noad k'minhag hazeh eno yochel liton tainis pesulin. This very strange language. The Gemara is going to point out that there's something missing here in the transmission of this brisa. But kol shelo noag, it should be kol shenoag haminhag hazeh eno yochel liton. Anyone who had the minhag, and there was a yichud between the chas and kal. Hey, it should have said that if they had the minhag, then there's no tainis psulim, because we assume that he had a beer with her. Ela seifa, but we're not going to do much better in the seifa, because the language of the seifa is kol shelo nohag. Now, kol shelo nohag implies that we're talking to the Baal, who is noeg the minhag of yichud. But wait a second. We're not talking in the Sefer about the minhag of yichud. We're talking about the minhag of shushvinon. He's not the one who wants to bring shushvinon to check him out. If a kol shelo muchmach mi boiler, it should be written in the reflexive form. Shalom, right? Kol shelo mushmash is eno yochel liton tainis psul, because we're afraid of chicanery. So Omer Abaye, we're going to have Abaye's understanding based on the Reisha, and then we're going to have Rava's understanding on the Sefer. Omer Abaye li olam ha-Reisha. So we're talking about Yichud b'Yehuda, Utni, and we should change the girsa in the brisa. We're very desperate. We'll have to change the text, and it should say kol shenoag. In other words, if he was noeg in Yehuda, that minhag of Yichud, he forfeits his rights to a tainis psul. Amalei Rava says, "What are you playing with the text? What is it, silly putty? Follow kol shelo noag tani. Ella Amar Rava hachikam." This is what the brisa has in mind. Kol shelo noag minhag golil b'golil, ela minhag Yehuda b'golil, eno yochel liton tainis psul. In Golil, the minhag was not to allow the chas and kal to be together in a private place before the Nitzuin, before the chuppah. But if, let's say, this particular chasan was noeg the minhag of Yehuda in Golil, and he had yichud with his kala before the chuppah, then ein lo tainis psul. So Gemara is going to ask Pshita. No, I'm sorry. The Rashba asks Pshita. Why do we need a chiddush here? I mean, if he was noeg the minhag of Yehuda, then by definition he forfeits his tainis psul. What were we thinking otherwise? So he writes the following, the Rashi. Let's see if we can figure it out. He says, Afshe ein anshe Golil Ramoim, right? There was no Ramos in Golil, as we said earlier, and that's why they weren't knowing the minig of Shishpina. So therefore, we should have assumed that anywhere in Golil there is a tiniest psula. Kamash balon, kevan shenisyachir ima, ein apetropos larayis labia ru'uyalo v'chazoka shebole. Okay. Kasha makes more sense than Teretz to me anyway. Rav Ashi Amar li Olam HaSeifa. When it says that they were bringing Shushvina to check out the Chasan, and now the Brisa says that if they didn't use Shushvina and he's not believed, we asked, it should have said Kol Shalo Mushmash. Tani, let's change the gears to the Brisa, Kol Shalo Mushmash. And again, we can imagine that Rava would object and say, how can you change the text of the Brisa? Now we start the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Yud Beis. Achas almanas Yisrael, v'achas almanas Kohanim ksubasa mana. Now I'm going to suspend my interpretation of the Reisha until we see the Sefer, because I think once we see the entire Mishnah, we'll go back to the beginning. The Mishnah continues and says, Bezdin shel Kohanim v'yigovim lebesula arba me'el zutz v'lo michu biyodem chacham. The Bezdin shel Kohanim, which is a Bezdin made up of 23 judges that sat and convened in the city of Kohanim, just like every city had its own Bezdin shel Yisrael, but in the city of Kohanim, they had a special Bezdin of 23 judges, and they established a minog that when a Bas Kohen gets married, and the Yisrael lucked out that he married a girl who's got such wonderful yichud, she's a Bas Kohen, that the ksuba should be doubled from 200 zuz to 400 zuz. And some say that the chiddush here is that we don't view the extra 200 zuz as a separate Tosefes ksuba, but rather we integrate it into the very fabric of the Ikar ksuba. And now the Ikar ksuba for a Bas Kohen is 400 zuz. And later on in Masechta Ksubas, the Gemara is going to ask about the differences between Ikar ksuba and Tosefes ksuba. Now let's go back to the Reisha. We have Almanas Kohanim, which means that he is marrying a Bas Kohen, but for her it's a second marriage. And the Mishnah establishes that the Ksuba is a Mana, just like it is for any Almana, an Almanas Yisrael. What's the Chiddush here? On the Shita Mekubetzes, he writes that we would have thought that for a Bas Kohen, you have to give half, who's an Almana, you have to give half of what you would have gotten as a B'sula. In other words, you reduce it by 50%. And since at the end of the Mishnah, the Bezdin Shel Kohanim established that a B'sula Bas Kohen gets 400 zuz, therefore a B'sula an Almana Bas Kohen should get 200 zuz. Mashma no. And we have to understand why, but the Mishnah is telling me a chiddush that all she gets is a mana, a Bas Kohen. Almana, who's now being remarried, will get only a mana like a Bas Yisrael. Almana. The Gemara says, Tana v'almanas Kohanim ksubasa masayim. So the Gemara asks for Anan Tanan. we have a Mishnah that says, Achas almonas Yisrael v'achas almonas kohen ksubas almona. How could the Brisa possibly say that the almona who's a bas kohen gets masayim zuz against the Mishnah? Rav Ashi shtei takonas hava. There were two historical periods of time when they had to determine what would be the level of payment of a ksuba for an almona bas kohen. Meikar originally takinu l'psula, arbamil zuzal almona, mana, that if she's a basula, a bas kohen, she deserves the highest level of ksuba, which is 400 zuz. If she's almona, even though she's a bas kohen, you know what? She has the same din as almonas bas Yisrael. That was the original takon.